The door of the Dusty Creek General Store flew open so hard it cracked against the interior wall, and every head in the building snapped toward the sound. Snow cascaded off the man's broad shoulders as he stood in the frame, his breath coming in great white plumes in the frozen January air, his dark eyes scanning the room with an urgency that made the floorboards seem to vibrate beneath everyone's boots. He was enormous, this man wide through the chest, tall enough that the lintel nearly grazed his fur-trimmed hat, and the raw, wind-carved desperation on his face silenced even old Hector Finch, who had not stopped talking since Christmas. Phineas Watkins had not come down from Reaper's Pass since the third week of October. Everyone in Dusty Creek, Colorado knew that. Everyone also knew why, or thought they did. The man preferred the silence of high altitude and the company of pine trees to anything the town had to offer. He trapped, he hunted, he kept to himself, and he came down in late autumn to sell his furs and gather enough supplies to last the winter, and that was the extent of his relationship with civilization. But it was January 14th, 1882, and Phineas Watkins had descended from the mountain in the dead of winter, and the look on his face was not that of a man who had run out of flour. His gaze found her immediately, the way a compass needle finds north helplessly, inevitably, as though the instrument had no say in the matter. Lydia Hart stood behind the counter of the store she had been managing for exactly 11 weeks, and the expression she wore when she saw him broke something open inside every person who witnessed it. Not relief, not joy, something rower than either. Something that looked honestly like the moment before a person either runs toward the thing that terrifies them most or runs away from it forever. "You need to leave," she said. Her voice was steady. Her hands, pressed flat against the counter, were not. Phineas walked toward her through the crowded store, past the Cracker Barrel and the bolts of calico and two ranchers who had sense enough to step sideways out of his path. He stopped at the counter, close enough that she had to tilt her chin up to hold his gaze, and he said, very quietly, so only she could hear it, "Tell me it isn't true." The color left Lydia Hart's face. And right then, in the cold stillness of that store, surrounded by witnesses and winter light, the story of the two of them. The story that had started in a golden October and nearly ended in the brutal machinery of other people's secrets cracked open like ice on a spring river, and everything underneath it came rushing, furious and cold and alive, to the surface. To understand how they had arrived at this moment, this terrible, electric, impossible moment, you have to go back to October, to the morning Lydia Hart stepped off the stage in Dusty Creek with a carpet bag in one hand, a letter of employment in the other, and absolutely no illusions about the life she was walking into. She was 26 years old, and she had survived things that would have destroyed someone with less iron in their spine. She had grown up in Cincinnati, the eldest daughter of a bookkeeper who drank more than he counted, and a mother who died of typhoid fever when Lydia was 14, leaving her in charge of 3 younger siblings and a household that operated on careful rationing and furious determination. She had worked since she was 15, first as a seamstress, then as a clerk in a dry goods establishment. Then, after her employer's wife became suspicious of the attention her husband paid to his young female employee, she had found herself suddenly unemployed, and through a chain of misfortunes that included a dishonest landlord and a stolen purse, very nearly destitute. The advertisement in the Cincinnati Enquirer had been brief and factual. General store manager needed, Dusty Creek, Colorado territory. Wages paid monthly. Room and board provided. References required. Apply to one Wallace Greer, proprietor. She had applied. She had been accepted. She had kissed her youngest sister Margaret on the forehead, pressed what little savings she had into the girl's hands. The older two were married now and settled, and she had boarded a train west. The stage from Pueblo to Dusty Creek had taken 2 days, and by the time it rolled into the small mountain town on a Tuesday morning in the first week of October, Lydia had a crick in her neck, dust in her teeth, and a reckless, terrifying hope crackling somewhere in her chest like a fire that didn't know yet if it had enough kindling to survive. Dusty Creek sat in a wide valley at the foot of a range of mountains that climbed, sharp and serious, into a sky so blue it looked painted. The town was not large: a main street, a church, a schoolhouse, a saloon, two competing livery stables, a hotel with 4 rooms, the general store, a blacksmith, a land office, and perhaps 300 souls spread across the valley and the surrounding ranches. But it was alive. She could feel that immediately, stepping down onto the packed dirt of the main street with her carpet bag banging against her knee. There was something purposeful about the people moving along the boardwalks, something that suggested this was a town that intended to be here in 20 years and was doing the daily work of making that intention real. Wallace Greer was a short, barrel-chested man of about 50 with a ginger mustache going gray at the edges and the expression of someone who had been recently surprised by life and was still deciding whether the surprise was good or bad. He met her at the door of the store, shook her hand with the vigor of a man half his age, and said, "Miss Hart, good, you look like someone who knows what work is." "I do," she said. "Good," he said again. "Come in and I'll show you everything." He had not exaggerated about the room and board. She was given a small, clean room above the store, with a window that looked out over the alley and a view of the mountain range beyond the rooftops. The room had a narrow iron bed, a washstand, a small pot-bellied stove, and a shelf for her books. It was, she thought, exactly the right size for a life she intended to build carefully. The store itself was the heart of the community in the way that general stores in small western towns always were. It was the place where news arrived and was redistributed, where disputes were quietly adjudicated over the counter, where credit was extended with a handshake and repaid in kind. Lydia took to it with the same focused competence she had brought to every position she had ever held, learning the inventory and the customers and the rhythms of the place with a thoroughness that earned Wallace Greer's visible approval within the first 2 weeks. It was in that second week that she first met Phineas Watkins. He had come in on a Wednesday afternoon, the bell above the door announcing him in the same way it announced everyone, but the room responding differently than it did to everyone else. A slight shift in the atmosphere, a collective awareness, like the way a herd of deer all lift their heads at the same moment when something large moves nearby. Lydia was measuring out coffee beans from the large burlap sack behind the counter, and she looked up. Her first thought was that he was too large to be entirely real. Her second thought, arriving almost immediately after, was that she had never seen a face quite like his, angular and weathered and severe, with dark brows and eyes so deep a brown they were nearly black, and a jaw that could have been cut from the same granite that formed the mountains above the town. He wore canvas trousers, heavy boots, a flannel shirt, and a canvas coat with a fur collar that suggested he spent most of his time in conditions that required serious insulation. He was perhaps 32 or 33, she guessed, old enough to have gathered a substantial collection of quiet around him, young enough that it hadn't yet gone into hardness. He walked to the counter and set down a list, written in a hand that surprised her: careful, educated, precise. "I'll need everything on that," he said. His voice was a low baritone, unhurried. She looked at the list. It was extensive and detailed. 50 pounds of dried beans, 40 pounds of flour, 20 pounds of cornmeal, 10 pounds of salt, 5 pounds of coffee, 3 pounds of tea, a quantity of dried fruit, ammunition in 2 specific calibers, lamp oil, 2 new lantern wicks, a particular kind of trap spring she had to look up in the catalog, and 6 yards of wool flannel. "This is a lot of goods," she said. "It's meant to last through April," he said without apology. She looked up from the list. He was watching her with an expression she couldn't immediately categorize. Not unfriendly, not particularly friendly either, just attentive in the way of someone who had learned to read the world carefully because the world, in his experience, sometimes tried to ambush you. "You're the new manager," he said. It wasn't a question. "Lydia Hart," she said, and extended her hand across the counter. He looked at it for a moment as though the gesture surprised him, and then he reached out and shook it. His hand was enormous and rough with callus and genuinely warm, and the contact lasted precisely 2 seconds before he withdrew. "Phineas Watkins," he said. "You're the trapper," she said. "Wallace mentioned you." Something moved across his face, brief and unreadable. "What did he mention?" "That you come down once or twice a season, that you're reliable with payment, that you prefer to conduct your business quickly and without conversation." She kept her tone perfectly neutral. "I'll try to honor the last one." The corner of his mouth moved. It wasn't quite a smile. It was the suggestion that under different circumstances he might have been capable of one. "I appreciate that," he said. She began pulling his order. He leaned against the counter and watched her work without fidgeting, which she respected. Most men who watched her work either tried to help in ways that weren't helpful or made comments that required patient ignoring. Phineas Watkins simply waited, and there was a quality to his silence that was, she realized, genuinely companionable, not empty but full, not absence but presence. The way the silence in a room with a fire is different from the silence in a room without one. She wrapped and packaged and tallied as she went, and when everything was assembled and she laid out the final number for him, he counted out the coins and bills without negotiation, which was rarer than it should have been. "That trap spring," she said, folding the receipt. "The one from the catalog. I can have it here in about 3 weeks if you want to leave an order." He nodded. "I'll be down for furs by then. I can pick it up. I'll set it aside." He loaded his purchases into a large pack frame he had left near the door, which spoke to the fact that he had walked down or come on horseback. She was about to ask when he straightened and caught her looking at the pack frame. "Horse is outside," he said, reading her correctly. "I don't carry all that up on foot." "I wasn't going to suggest you were made of iron," she said. This time the corner of his mouth moved further, and it was almost a full smile. "I've been called worse," he said, and he picked up the pack frame and walked out, and the bell rang above the door, and the room returned to its normal atmospheric pressure. She stood at the counter for a moment, aware that her hands were doing something strange still. For once, instead of constantly moving in the busy efficiency that characterized everything she did. She looked down at them and then deliberately picked up the next task waiting for her, and told herself firmly that a man who lived up a mountain in deliberate isolation and who preferred the company of pine trees to people was precisely not the kind of thing she needed to be thinking about. He came back 3 weeks later as he had said he would. He collected the trap spring, paid for it, sold Wallace Greer a bundle of early furs, and this time when she was packaging up a small additional order he'd added to the list, another pound of coffee, a bottle of ink, and a book that she had ordered for him on instinct, guessing from the handwriting on his list that a man who wrote like that had opinions about reading. He stopped when he saw the book. "I didn't order that," he said. "No," she agreed. "It's by a fellow named Richard Proctor, Astronomical Essays. We got 2 copies in last week and I thought." She paused because she realized she had been about to explain her reasoning, and her reasoning, examined honestly, was that she had thought of him when she saw it, and that was a degree of honesty she was not prepared to offer a stranger. "I set it aside in case you wanted it. No obligation." He picked it up. He turned it over in his hands with the careful attention of someone who had a specific relationship with books. He opened the front cover and read the first page. "How much?" he said. She told him the price. He paid it without comment and tucked it into his pack. At the door he turned. "You read," he said. "Constantly," she said. "It's either that or go mad." "Same," he said, and this time the smile was real and brief and devastating, and then he was gone. He came down one more time in October, on a day that smelled like snow coming, a Tuesday afternoon when the light had gone flat and thin, and the mountains above the town had disappeared behind a low ceiling of iron-colored cloud. He bought the last of his winter supplies, a particular brand of liniment that he used for weather-related joint pain. She guessed from the specific request, though she didn't say so, and he lingered, which was new. She was sorting a shipment of canned goods onto the shelves, and he stood at the counter without immediately announcing what else he needed. And she let the silence run because she had learned in 3 visits that he did not fill silence the way most people did, and that pushing into it too quickly made him go still and closed. After a moment he said, "The Proctor book was good." "Was it what you expected?" she asked without turning from the shelf. "Better," he said. "The chapter on the transit of Venus." "Have you read it?" She had. She turned. "I thought the argument about the parallax measurements was flawed," she said. "He makes an assumption about atmospheric refraction that I don't think holds." Phineas Watkins stared at her, not rudely, just with the particular quality of attention of someone who has just heard something they genuinely did not expect and is revising, rapidly and visibly, their understanding of a situation. "I thought that too," he said, and the words came out with a quality she could only describe as startled delight, carefully restrained. They talked for 23 minutes. She knew this because she glanced at the clock above the door when the conversation began and again when it ended, not to time it, but because the clerk's part of her mind that tracked everything was always running. They talked about the book, and then about a different book, and then about whether the new observatory being planned in California would change what was knowable about the solar system. And the conversation moved with the ease of water finding its natural course, effortless, and without the awkward stumbles that plagued conversation between people who were not actually interested in the same things, and were merely performing interest to fill space. When he finally picked up his purchases and started toward the door, she was aware of something she hadn't felt in a very long time, the specific, clean pleasure of having been genuinely met by another mind. "Safe travels up," she said. He paused at the door. He didn't turn. "You'll be here," he said, "when I come down in spring." "That's the plan," she said. He nodded once and walked out. She did not hear from him again for 3 months. In those 3 months, the town of Dusty Creek shaped itself around her in the way places do when you stay long enough to become part of the pattern. She learned which ranchers paid their accounts reliably, and which required a gentle but firm reminder at month's end. She learned that the woman who came in every Thursday for her flour and dried fruit was named Clara Birch, and had the sharpest mind in the valley if you could get her talking. She learned that the 2 livery stable owners' brothers named Croft, who had not spoken directly to each other in 11 years over a disputed land boundary. Both came to the store on Friday mornings and arranged their visits so they would never be there simultaneously, and that this required a scheduling finesse on her part that she had quietly come to see as one of the more interesting challenges of the job. She also learned, in the way of small communities, about Phineas Watkins. What she learned was partial and inconsistent in the way that second-hand information always is, but certain elements appeared consistently enough to take as reliable. He had come to Colorado about 6 years earlier. From somewhere in the East, opinions differed on whether it was Pennsylvania or New York. He had filed a claim on a section of land that included access to a seasonal trapper's cabin near Reaper's Pass, which was at roughly 9,000 feet elevation, and accessible in winter only by a single narrow track that became genuinely dangerous after heavy snowfall. He had no family in the territory that anyone knew of. He bought his supplies from the general store, sold his furs to a buyer who came through town twice a year, and otherwise existed in a kind of orbit around Dusty Creek that was close enough to maintain a practical relationship with the town and far enough to maintain the distance that seemed, for whatever reason, essential to him. Wallace Greer, who had a quiet understanding of people and did not gossip carelessly, told her one afternoon when they were doing inventory. He had something happen to him. Before, don't know what, and it's not my business to speculate, but a man doesn't choose a 9,000-foot mountain in winter for the view. He chooses it because it puts a sufficient obstacle between himself and something he's trying to stay away from. Lydia, carefully counting bolts of fabric, said, "That could be any number of things." "Could be," Wallace agreed. "I expect you'll find out eventually." She looked at him. "What makes you say that?" He gave her the look of a man who has observed several things he is too polite to state directly and is allowing the observation to speak for itself without elaboration. November became December. The snow came to Dusty Creek in earnest, filling the streets and loading the pine trees and transforming the mountain range above the town into something so beautiful it was almost painful to look at directly. The store was busy, people stocking up, people coming in just to have somewhere warm to stand for 10 minutes, people conducting the slow social maintenance that was necessary in any community where the dark and cold of winter pressed everyone inward. Lydia managed all of it with the steady competence that had by now made her, she was aware, something that Dusty Creek seemed to have needed without knowing it, a capable, fair-minded, sharp presence at the center of the town's commercial and social life. She thought about Phineas Watkins more than she was comfortable with. She thought about the astronomical conversation. She thought about the way he had asked, without inflection, whether she would still be there in spring. A question that had operated on multiple levels simultaneously, the way certain sentences do when the speaker and the listener both understand that the surface meaning is not the only one. She thought about the quality of his silence and the warmth of his hand and the brief, devastating reality of that smile. She also thought, practically, about the fact that whatever was driving this man up a mountain at 9,000 feet in January was not something to romance herself into imagining she understood. Whatever his dark past was, and she was certain there was one, it had shaped him into someone who maintained a deliberate and structured distance from the world. She, of all people, understood what it meant to build walls for good reasons. She had her own reasons, her own history of trusting the wrong situation, the wrong assumption about safety and permanence. So she thought about him, and she managed the thoughts carefully, and she got on with the work. The trouble arrived in December, and it wore the face of a man named Ellis Crane. Crane was a land speculator. She understood this immediately, in the practiced way of someone who had grown up reading other people's true intentions beneath the surface performance of their stated ones. He came into the store on a Thursday in mid-December, dressed in clothes that were too good for Dusty Creek but not good enough for the city he clearly wished he were in, and he purchased a small amount of goods and asked, with the elaborate casualness of someone who has rehearsed the question, about property in the area. She told him with equal casualness that she ran a store and not a land office, and directed him down the street. He came back the next day, and the day after that. By the fourth visit she had identified the pattern. He was not primarily interested in land. He was interested in information. Specifically, he was asking questions gently, insertionally, almost imperceptibly embedded in ordinary conversation, about who owned what land in the valley and in the higher elevations, what claims had been registered, and whether there were any tracts with water rights that might be available. He asked, on his fifth visit, in that same elaborately casual way, about the trapper up at Reaper's Pass. Lydia felt something go cold and sharp inside her. "I'm not familiar with who might be trapping where," she said, with a pleasant and entirely false openness. "You'd want the land office for claim information." "Of course," Crane said, smiling. He had a broad, practiced smile that showed all his teeth and reached nowhere near his eyes. "Just curious. Someone told me there was a fellow who'd been up near the pass for years. Prime land up there, I'd imagine. Running water year-round at that elevation, from what I hear. Winter's a difficult time to be surveying at that elevation," she said, "or so I'd imagine." He smiled again. "Spring surveying, then," he said. "No hurry." He bought a tin of tobacco and left. She watched him go and then stood at the counter with her hands flat against the wood and thought very carefully about what she had just observed and what it implied. A land speculator sniffing around a remote property. A man who seemed to know, specifically, about a particular tract at high elevation with year-round water. The kind of man who asked questions in a way that assumed you didn't notice he was asking them. Whatever Crane's hidden motive was, it sat uncomfortably close to the only person in Dusty Creek, or above it, whom she had found herself genuinely thinking about for 2 months. She went to Wallace Greer that evening, when the store was closed and they were sitting in the back room with cups of coffee, doing the month's accounts. She described Crane's visits with precision dates, words used, specific questions, and she watched Wallace's expression shift from mild interest to a careful, concerned attention. "Crane," he said. "I've heard that name." "Where?" He was quiet for a moment. "There was a piece in the Pueblo paper last spring. Land disputes in the Sangre de Cristo Range. A company, some Denver investment concern, had been filing secondary claims on properties where they could find any procedural irregularity in the original filing, forcing the original owners into either a legal fight or a sale." He looked at her steadily. "The piece mentioned an agent named Crane." Lydia felt the pieces align with a cold precision. "Phineas Watkins's claim," she said. "He filed 6 years ago," Wallace said. "In the early days of the territorial period, filings were sometimes not as meticulously documented as they ought to have been. I don't know the specifics of his filing." "Someone does," she said, "or suspects they might be able to find a gap in it." Wallace nodded slowly. "The issue is," he said, choosing his words with care, "that I have no way to warn him. He doesn't come down until spring. There's no sending a letter up that pass in January." She looked at him. He looked at her. "No," she said. "I didn't say anything," he said. "You were thinking something." "I was thinking," he said carefully, "that the track up to Reaper's Pass, while inadvisable in January, is technically passable for someone who knows what they're doing and has the right equipment and starts early enough in the morning to have good daylight. You were thinking I should go up there." "I was thinking," he said, "that the only other option is to wait until spring, at which point Crane will almost certainly have had time to set whatever trap he's planning. And I was thinking that you've made a fair impression of someone who's bothered by that kind of injustice." She was quiet for a long moment. The fire in the small stove crackled. Outside, the wind moved along the eaves of the building with a low, purposeful sound. "What if he doesn't want a warning from a stranger?" she said. "Then you've wasted a cold morning," Wallace said. "But you'll know you tried." She thought about it for 2 more days. She thought about the trap being set, the hidden motive, the deliberate targeting of someone who had no way of knowing what was being aimed at him from below. She thought about Crane's practiced smile and his strategic questions. She thought about 6 years of a man building a life at 9,000 feet, and what it would mean to have that life dismantled by someone, with a folder of legal papers and a scheme. She also thought, and she was honest with herself about this, that she was not entirely motivated by justice alone, that there was something else, something she was less comfortable naming, underneath the decision she was reaching. On the morning of January 9th, she borrowed Wallace's winter horse, a thick-muscled gray named Bramble who had been up mountain trails before and whose judgment in snow, Wallace assured her, was better than most humans, and she set out for Reaper's Pass before first light, wearing every warm thing she owned and with directions written in Wallace's steady hand in her coat pocket. The track up to the pass was not actually a track in January. It was a theory of a track, a suggestion of a path through pine forest and rock field and open snowfield that required reading the landscape carefully and trusting the horse. Bramble moved through it with a methodical confidence that she found genuinely reassuring, picking his footing on the steep sections with the patience of an animal who understood that going carefully was faster than going wrong. It took 3.5 hours. The cabin appeared through the trees in the mid-morning light, a structure built with the specific purpose and solidity of something meant to endure. It was larger than she had expected, not elaborate but serious, with a stone chimney sending a thin column of smoke into the pale sky, and a woodpile stacked to a height that indicated the occupant was thorough and had done this before. There was a smaller outbuilding that she guessed was used for storage and possibly for the skinning and preparation of furs. She was aware, as she dismounted and tied Bramble to a post by the door, that she was trespassing on a private life that had been constructed specifically to keep people at a distance, and that she had not, despite considerable thought on the subject, worked out exactly what she was going to say. She knocked. The door opened, and Phineas Watkins stood in front of her in the mountain mourning, his expression making the rapid and visible transition from the neutral preparation for an unknown situation to genuine, unmistakable shock. "Miss Hart," he said. "Mr. Watkins," she said. "I apologize for the intrusion. I need to talk to you." He looked at her. He looked at Bramble. He looked at the sky, as though checking the weather with the automatic concern of someone who understood exactly how serious mountain weather could be for someone on horseback who needed to get back down. "Come in," he said, and stood aside. The interior of the cabin was warm and, despite its isolation, not Spartan in the way she might have expected. It was organized with a careful precision, every tool in its place, the storage arranged with practical intelligence, the shelves along one wall holding an amount of books that confirmed everything she had already suspected about him. There was a large work table, a stone fireplace with a good fire, a second smaller stove for cooking, and a wooden chair angled toward the fire beside a smaller table that held a lantern and an open book, spine up the Proctor book she had sold him, she noticed, not without a private reaction. He poured coffee from a pot on the stove without asking whether she wanted it and set it in front of her at the table, and she sat down and wrapped her hands around the mug and told him everything. She was precise and thorough, because precision and thoroughness were what the situation required, and because those were also simply how her mind worked. She described Crane, his appearance, his questions, the way those questions had been structured to gather information while appearing to be idle conversation. She described what Wallace Greer had told her about the Pueblo paper and the Denver Investment Company, and the pattern of targeting claims with procedural irregularities. She laid it out methodically, without drama, the way you present information to someone who you need to actually understand it rather than react to it. When she finished, there was a silence. Phineas sat across the table from her, both hands wrapped around his own mug, and he was looking at the table's surface with the expression of someone doing a rapid internal inventory that has turned up something unexpected in a drawer that was supposed to be empty. "My filing," he said. "There's a gap in it." She waited. "When I filed the claim," he said slowly, "the office in Pueblo had a deputy registrar handling filings because the head registrar was sick. The deputy had me sign 2 copies of the filing document but only recorded one of them in the ledger. I didn't know at the time. I wasn't experienced with the process. I realized later, a year or so after, that I should have gone back and confirmed the dual recording, but by then I'd been up here and—" He stopped. He looked at his hands. "I let it go. I thought it didn't matter in practical terms." "It matters," she said. "If a company like the one being described finds that gap, they can file a secondary claim that asserts the original was incomplete. They'd have to argue it in a territorial court, but courts can be influenced and—" "I know how it works," he said quietly, and there was something in the way he said it that confirmed Wallace Greer's assessment, that this was a man who had encountered the machinery of institutional bad faith before, probably in circumstances connected to whatever had sent him up this mountain in the first place. "I thought you should know," she said. He looked up. His eyes held hers for a long moment, and she felt, in the way of someone who is generally very good at reading situations correctly, that she was being seen, not assessed, not measured, but genuinely seen in the full and specific sense of that word. "You came up here," he said, "in January. 3.5 hours up a mountain track in snow. Wallace's horse is very reliable," she said. "That's not what He stopped. He set down his mug. "Why?" The question sat between them with a weight and directness that did not allow for easy evasion. She had spent 2 days constructing an answer that was adequate and honest, but did not require her to be more transparent than the situation warranted. And now, Sitting across from him in his warm cabin with the fire behind him and the mountain pressing its vast silence against the walls, she found that the constructed answer had dissolved and left her with only the true one. "Because it wasn't right," she said. "What's being aimed at you? And someone needed to tell you, and I was the one who knew, and I was the one who was going to be able to live with myself or not live with myself, depending on whether I did the right thing with information like that." She paused. "And because," she added more quietly, "I have spent 2 months thinking about a 23-minute conversation about a chapter on the transit of Venus, and it seemed like a pity for the person I had that conversation with to have their life dismantled by a man with a fraudulent filing strategy." The silence after this statement had a different quality from the silences that had preceded it. Phineas Watkins looked at her across the table with an expression that was complicated and open in a way she had not yet seen on his face, and she had the distinct impression that she had just said something that reached past the careful structure of distance he had built around himself and touched something he had believed was no longer accessible. "You should eat something," he said finally, "and warm up properly before you start back down." "That's your response," she said. "That's my first response," he said. "The rest will take longer." He made her a meal: dried beans cooked with salt pork, cornbread baked in the cast iron skillet on the stove with the same methodical competence with which he seemed to do everything, and they ate at the table and talked, and the conversation moved the way it had in the store, that same effortless current, covering the immediate practical problem of his claim, and then moving naturally into other things, the books on his shelf, the winter on the mountain. The particular quality of silence at 9,000 feet that was, he explained, not an absence but a presence, something with weight and texture that he had come to think of as a companion. "What made you come up here?" she asked, when the meal was done and they were sitting with the second cups of coffee and the fire was saying its slow, orange things to the room. "Originally." He was quiet for long enough that she thought he might not answer. "There was a woman," he said, "in Pennsylvania. I believed we were building a life. She was from a family with more money than mine, and her father had other ideas about what that life should look like, and he was not a man who let other people's ideas interfere with his own. He had me removed from my position. I was teaching at a small college, mathematics and natural philosophy, by a series of accusations that were not true but that were structured to be impossible to disprove. Forced choice: leave the college, leave the town, or face a public trial in which the outcome was already determined." He paused. "She did not come with me. I don't entirely blame her. It was a trap with no clean way out." "I'm sorry," she said. "It was 6 years ago," he said, in the tone of a man who has made a careful accounting of what the time has cost and paid it. "That doesn't always make it smaller," she said. He looked at her. "No," he said, "it doesn't." She told him in turn not the whole of her history but enough: the mother lost early, the siblings raised, the years of working and the precarity of depending on other people's fairness in a world that didn't always distribute fairness evenly, the landlord in Cincinnati, the employer's wife, the advertisement in the newspaper, and the gamble of coming west. "It seems like we've both spent some time," he said, "having the floor pulled out from under us by other people's hidden motives." "It seems like it," she said. "And you walked back toward it," he said. "Coming up here, that took a specific kind of courage." "Or stubbornness," she said. "The two are often confused." He smiled, the full smile this time, without the usual restraint on it, and she understood in that moment with absolute clarity that she was in serious trouble, in the best possible sense of that word, and that whatever she had told herself in October about careful management of her own thoughts had been, at best, a partial success. She started back down in the early afternoon, with enough daylight margin to be safe. He walked bramble to the tree line for her and held the horse while she mounted, and then he looked up at her with the mountain and the cold sky behind him. "I'll need to come down," he said, "to deal with the claim, talk to a lawyer in Pueblo maybe." "Wallace Greer knows everyone," she said. "He'll point you in the right direction." "I'll come down in January," he said. when I've thought through what needs to happen." There was something in the way he said it, something that indicated January was not primarily about the legal problem, and they both understood this, and neither of them said anything further about it, because some things are better left as the mutual understanding that they are rather than reduced into the clumsy apparatus of words. She rode back down the mountain in the flat winter light, and the cold was extraordinary, and the sky above the valley when she emerged from the tree line was the deep, saturated blue of a world that had no interest in being subtle, and she felt more alive than she had in several years, which was either a very good sign or a very dangerous one. And she had, by the time Bramble's hooves found the packed dirt of Dusty Creek's main street, decided that she was done distinguishing between the two. What she did not know, riding back down, was that Ellis Crane had been watching the road out of town when she left in the morning, that he had noted the direction she went, that he had made his own calculations and arrived at a conclusion that made the cold, predatory part of him go still and focused in the way of a man who has just seen an advantage. She also did not know that Crane had not been working alone. The man behind Crane, the man who had identified the gap in Phineas Watkins's claim and authorized the scheme, was a Denver investor named Harlan Foss, who had made a considerable portion of his fortune by finding exactly these situations. Isolated men with technical vulnerabilities in their property filings, no social network to mount a legal defense, and too much pride to accept a lowball buyout offer, which gave Foss's lawyers the opportunity to take the property in court for a fraction of its value. It was not illegal, strictly speaking. It was simply a form of violence that the law had not yet gotten around to explicitly prohibiting. Foss had come to Dusty Creek himself quietly, staying at the hotel under a different name, to oversee this particular case, because the land at Reaper's Pass was not just a trapper's cabin. It was, according to the geological survey done by a man on Foss's payroll the previous summer, the site of a significant quartz formation with strong indicators of silver mineralization. The water rights that went with the property were also, in the coming age of rail expansion and town building, worth considerably more than Watkins almost certainly realized. This was not a scheme about getting a trapper's cabin. This was a scheme about silver, Crane reported to Foss that evening. And Foss, hearing that the woman from the store had ridden up toward Reaper's Pass and come back in the afternoon, decided to accelerate his timeline. The next morning, he came into the store himself. Lydia recognized the type before she knew his name, the particular cut of a man who has spent so long being the one who holds the cards that he has stopped being able to imagine a table where he isn't. He introduced himself under a false name, bought a small item, and then spent 5 careful minutes. She counted building toward the question he actually wanted to ask, which was whether she had had occasion to visit the trapper up at Reaper's Pass recently. She looked at him with a pleasantness so thorough and so completely surface level that it would have been recognizable to anyone who had ever worked in customer service and understood the specific face you put on when the customer in front of you is making a decision about whether to be a problem. "I'm afraid I go where business takes me," she said, "and business is here in the store." Foss smiled the smile of a man who had heard worse lies and was not particularly bothered by them. "Of course," he said. "Well, if you happen to know how to reach the fellow Watkins, I believe his name is, I represent some interests that might find his property quite valuable and would offer a fair price." "I understand," she said. "I'll keep that in mind." He left. She watched him go and felt the shape of what was happening with a clarity that was not comforting. They were accelerating. Whatever procedural trap they had been planning to set in spring was being moved forward, possibly because they suspected she had warned Watkins, possibly because Foss himself had come to town, and his presence meant the investment had reached a stage where it needed to resolve quickly. She sent a letter with the next rider going south toward Pueblo, addressed to a lawyer Wallace Greer recommended named Tobias Cullen, who had a reputation for taking cases involving improper land claims, and who had, according to Wallace, successfully argued several of them before the territorial court. She explained the situation with the precision she brought to everything, laid out what she knew of Foss's company and Crane's information gathering, and described the gap in Watkins's filing and what it would take to close it. And then she waited. Phineas came down on January 14th. He came down on the gray horse he kept in a small stable at the edge of the property. She hadn't seen the horse on her visit, but Wallace had told her he had one. He came down in the morning, on a day when the sky was that particular flat white that preceded serious snow, and he came directly to the store. She had not known he was coming on that specific day. She had not known he was coming at all. She had told herself deliberately that she would manage the situation on her end and let him manage it on his end, and that whatever January meant, it would arrive in its own time. But he walked through that door with the snow on his shoulders and the urgency on his face that she had never seen on him before, and the room went quiet the way rooms go quiet when they understand that something true is about to happen in them. And he looked at her across all those people and all that ordinary morning air and said, "Tell me it isn't true." She had, in the instant before he said it, absolutely no idea what he meant. And then she understood with a sickening drop of comprehension that someone had gotten to him before she could tell him herself. "Who told you?" she said. "A man came up to the pass 2 days ago," he said. "Said he was representing a land company. Said they had filed a secondary claim and it would be heard in territorial court in March. Said," he stopped. The muscle in his jaw worked. He said the woman from the general store in Dusty Creek had provided information that helped them identify the vulnerability in the filing. The silence in the store was absolute. Lydia felt the cold of that accusation move through her the way real cold moves, not all at once but penetratingly, reaching the places where you thought you were insulated and finding out you weren't. "That," she said, very quietly and very clearly, "is not true." "I know," he said. She stopped. "No," he said again, and his voice, which had been carrying something strained and urgent, shifted into something quieter and more certain. "I rode down to say I know. I need you to know that I know." She stared at him. The other people in the store were having the collective experience of witnessing something that they would be discussing for the next 6 months, but she was no longer in a room full of people. She was in a room with one person and the rest was details. "They're trying to separate us," she said. "Yes," he said, "by making you distrust me before you got here." "Yes," he said, "it didn't work." "Why not?" she asked genuinely, not theatrically. She needed to know this. "Because," he said, with the deliberate honesty of a man who has had 3 days on a mountain to decide exactly what he is going to say when he gets down, "I have been thinking about you since October. And what I know of your character from 3 visits and 1 astronomical conversation, and 1 January morning in my cabin, tells me that you are precisely the kind of person who would ride 3.5 hours up a mountain in the snow to warn someone about a scheme being aimed at them. And precisely not the kind of person who would help the scheme." The fire in the wood stove crackled. Someone in the back of the store very quietly set down a tin can. "Tobias Cullen," she said. "I wrote to him last week. Wallace says he's the right lawyer for this." "Good," Phineas said. "Foss himself is in town," she said, "staying at the hotel. He came here under a false name." Phineas's expression shifted into something controlled and deliberate. "Does Wallace know?" "Wallace and I figured it out yesterday," she said. "We have his real name from the Pueblo paper." "Then we go to Wallace," Phineas said. "Now." She came out from behind the counter. She looked at the assembled witnesses. "Clara," she said, to Clara Birch, who was standing near the cracker barrel with her arms full of cloth goods, "could you possibly mind the counter for 20 minutes?" Clara Birch, who had the sharpest mind in the valley and an expression that suggested she had understood everything that had just happened and approved of it entirely, said, "Take as long as you need." They went to Wallace Greer's back office, all 3 of them, and spent an hour planning. Wallace had already sent an additional letter to Cullen by a faster rider. He had also, through the particular social intelligence of a man who had run the community's commercial center for 20 years, quietly confirmed that the man staying at the hotel under the name, Mr. George Hartwell, had, on 2 separate evenings, met in the hotel dining room with Ellis Crane. He had a description of Foss from the Pueblo paper, and the description matched. "He's committed fraud by using a false name in his dealings with you," Wallace said to Lydia. "That's not nothing. Cullen can use that." "The primary issue is the claim filing," Phineas said. "The deputy registrar who processed my filing, do we know if he's still in Pueblo?" "Cullen's looking into it," Lydia said. "If the deputy is still there and can testify that the dual recording was an administrative failure on his part rather than a deficiency in your filing, the secondary claim falls apart." Phineas nodded. He was sitting across the table from her in Wallace's back office, and the earlier urgency on his face had resolved into something more focused, the particular concentration of a man who has converted anxiety into a plan. She found it, honestly, remarkable to watch. "There's something else," he said, and both she and Wallace waited. When the man came up to the pass to present the secondary claim notice, he was not alone. There was another man with him who waited at the tree line. I couldn't see him clearly, but the man who spoke to me, the one representing Foss's company, he referenced information about the water rights on the property that would have required a survey of the land itself, not just a reading of the filing. "Someone was on your property," Lydia said. "Last summer," he said. "I found evidence of it at the time but didn't understand what it meant. Tracks, a campsite on the eastern meadow, a blaze on one of the trees that I didn't put there." "Trespass," Wallace said. "That's also something Cullen can use." They built the case methodically, detail by detail, the way you build something that has to hold weight. When they emerged from the back office, Lydia found the store had continued to run itself in her absence with a reliability that spoke well of Clara Birch, who accepted Lydia's thanks with the tranquility of a woman who had been underestimated for so long that competence had become its own private satisfaction. Phineas stayed in Dusty Creek. He took a room at the hotel, a decision that Lydia understood was deliberate, a kind of declaration of presence, a refusal to retreat back up the mountain while the problem was unresolved. She also suspected, though she was not yet in a position to say so, that his reasons for staying were not entirely strategic. The next several days were the most compressed and consequential days she could remember since arriving in Colorado. Cullen replied by wire. Wallace had sent the additional details by telegram and confirmed he was coming north from Pueblo. Foss, evidently alerted to something through his own networks, attempted to meet with Lydia privately, which she declined through the studied politeness of someone who knows exactly what they are declining and finds the attempt instructive about the character of the person making it. Phineas came to the store every morning, ostensibly to discuss the case developments with her and Wallace. Actually, and they both knew this, and the knowing of it was a constant low frequency of warmth running beneath everything else, because the store was where she was. On the third morning, when the other customers had attended to their business and gone, and Wallace had absented himself to the back room with the transparent discretion of a man who is excellent at knowing when to not be in the front room, Phineas stood at the counter and looked at her and said, "I haven't told you why I came down as soon as I heard." "You said you knew the accusation wasn't true," she said. "That's not the real reason," he said. The real reason was, he paused, and she watched him working through a sentence that was clearly more difficult than the mathematical and legal ones he had been assembling all week. "The real reason was that someone had implied something about you that I could not let stand for a single hour longer than was absolutely necessary. I needed to be in front of you. That was the primary need. The legal problem was secondary." She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, the January wind moved along the street with its cold, purposeful commentary. "Phineas," she said, "that is the most roundabout declaration I have ever heard." He looked at her with an expression caught precisely between mortification and a helpless, genuine warmth. "I am aware," he said, Mathematics comes more naturally. Then be mathematical about it, she said. He was quiet for a moment and then, I've been in love with you since approximately the transit of Venus. She felt the warmth of it move through her like the first real heat after a long cold, not a shock, because she had known it was coming, had known since October in the way you know certain things before they arrive, but present and real and lovely in a way that the anticipation of it had not fully prepared her for. Since October, she said. Since October, he confirmed. That's a long time to live at 9,000 feet with a feeling like that, she said. It is, he agreed. I don't recommend it. She came around the counter, which was not something she did while the store was open as a general rule, and she stood in front of him and looked up at him in the gray January light coming through the front windows, and she said, I've been in love with you since the transit of Venus too. He reached out and took her hand, the way he had not done when she shook his across the counter in October, but in a different way now. Not a handshake, but a holding. His large, warm hand around hers with a care that knew what it was doing. And she thought that this specific thing, right here, in the cold light of a general store in January, was what she had been working toward without fully knowing it for the past several years, and probably long before that. There are still considerable obstacles, he said. Yes, she said, the legal situation, FOSS, the gap in the filing. Yes, she said, none of that has changed. No, she agreed, but the calculation has. He understood what she meant. You solve problems differently when the result of the calculation is something you are determined to protect. You bring different resources, different urgency, different precision. He kept holding her hand while Wallace Greer, in the back room, made considerably more noise with the inventory than was strictly necessary for the task. Tobias Cullen arrived 3 days later on the southbound stage. A lean, sharp-featured man of about 45 with a battered leather case, and the focused energy of someone who genuinely enjoyed the particular intellectual combat of territorial law. He sat in Wallace Greer's back office with all three of them and went through every document and piece of information Lydia had assembled with a thoroughness that made her respect him immediately. The deputy registrar, Cullen said when he had finished his review. His name is Ambrose Pike. He is still in Pueblo, retired now, but available. I spoke to him before coming here. He remembers the Watkins filing. He remembers it, Phineas said. He remembers it specifically, Cullen said, because he made a similar administrative error on 4 other filings around the same time. There was a backlog that month, and he was handling a volume of work the office wasn't equipped for, and he has been carrying a considerable amount of guilt about it for 6 years. He is prepared to testify to the error being administrative and on the office's side, not a deficiency in the original filing. Lydia felt the first genuine loosening of the tension she had been carrying since December. Will that be sufficient? She asked. It will be very helpful, Cullen said carefully. The secondary claim Foss's company filed is technically arguable either way. The territorial court could find for them if Pike's testimony is not sufficient or is challenged. But he paused. The trespass matter strengthens our position considerably, and the fraud, the false name. He looked at Lydia. You are willing to testify that he identified himself falsely in a commercial interaction? Absolutely, she said. Good. Combined with the evidence of unauthorized survey activity on the property, we have a case that Foss's lawyers will recognize as uncomfortable for them to take to a full hearing. Men like Foss prefer to win quietly. A hearing with testimony from a retired registrar, a land claim manager, and a local community figure, he nodded to Wallace, is not quiet. You think he'll withdraw, Phineas said. I think, Cullen said, that we make a sufficient demonstration of force that withdrawing becomes his preferred option. But we do it in front of the court. We don't negotiate privately. Foss is counting on private negotiation, on wearing down an isolated individual. We take it public, and we take it formal, and we take it on the terms where our evidence is strongest. The territorial court hearing was set for March, and between January and March, Dusty Creek continued to be Dusty Creek. The ranchers came for their supplies. The schoolteacher came for her chalk and paper. The Croft brothers came on separate Friday mornings, and Clara Birch came on Thursdays for her flour and dried fruit and her conversation, which had become one of the genuine pleasures of the week. And Phineas Watkins, who had come down from the mountain in January and had not gone back up. He stayed. He helped Wallace with the heavier work around the store deliveries, unloading shipments, the kind of physical labor that the older man found increasingly uncomfortable in the cold months. He did not do this performatively or with any announcement. He simply appeared and was useful, in the practical and quietly purposeful way of someone for whom competence is a natural language. He and Lydia spent evenings together, sometimes in the back room of the store with Wallace, going over case documents with Cullen, who had taken a room at the hotel for the duration. Sometimes just the two of them, in the small sitting room that was part of Wallace's living quarters above the store, talking about everything and nothing, the way people in love talk when the world outside is cold and the fire inside is good, and there is nowhere either of them would rather be. He told her about Pennsylvania, more of it than he had shared in the cabin. The woman he had loved, whose name was Alina, and whose failure to come with him he had eventually understood was not cowardice, but the result of a lifetime in which her own choices had been so thoroughly managed by her father that she had not, by the time the crisis arrived, had sufficient practice at making autonomous ones. He did not say this with bitterness. He said it with the sorrow of someone who has spent sufficient time with a painful thing to have understood it from multiple angles. "You forgave her," Lydia said. "Eventually," he said. "It took a while to understand that forgiving her wasn't the same as forgiving him. Her father, that took longer. I'm not certain I'm finished." "That's honest," she said. "You asked an honest question," he said. She told him about Cincinnati more thoroughly, the ledger of daily survival that her childhood had been, the way she had learned to read situations quickly because, in a household where resources were thin, and the adult responsible for making decisions was not reliable, you had to read things quickly or suffer the consequences of missing the early indicators. She told him about the employer whose wife had fired her, and the landlord and the stripped-back decision to come west with almost nothing. "You weren't afraid?" he asked. "I was terrified," she said. "But I've found that being terrified and doing the thing anyway is usually better than the alternative." He looked at her with that expression she had come to know, the one where something was visible behind his eyes that he was making a decision about, and the decision was going toward openness. "When I came down in January," he said, "when I walked through that door, I was terrified." "You didn't look it," she said. "I was," he said. "Because I knew before I walked in, I knew what I was going to have to do. That I was going to have to choose to trust you in a situation where I'd been given a reason not to. And the last time I chose to trust someone in a situation that required courage, the person wasn't able to be there. And I'd built an entire life at 9,000 feet partly on not being in that situation again." She reached across the small table between them and put her hand over his. "I'm here," she said. "You're here," he agreed, and turned his hand under hers so that their fingers intertwined, and the fire said its slow things, and outside the February wind talked to the eaves, and the two of them were quiet in the specific way of people who have run out of the need to fill silence with anything other than themselves. The case came to the territorial court in Pueblo on a gray March morning, and Cullen was exactly right about the effect of public and formal proceedings on a man like Harlan Foss. The hearing lasted 2 days. Ambrose Pike testified clearly and without equivocation that the registration gap was the result of an administrative failure in his office. Lydia testified about Foss's false identification and the specific questions Crane had used to gather information. Wallace Greer testified as a community witness to the general standing and reliability of Phineas Watkins as a property holder in the Dusty Creek area. Cullen presented the evidence of unauthorized survey activity on the property with a precision that the opposing lawyers found difficult to rebut cleanly. On the afternoon of the second day, Foss's lawyers requested a brief recess. During the recess, Cullen came back to their table where Lydia and Phineas sat side by side with Wallace behind them, and said, in a low voice, "They want to settle. They'll withdraw the secondary claim entirely, pay the court costs, and agree to a formal recorded statement that the original Watkins filing is valid and complete." Phineas looked at Lydia. Lydia looked at Phineas. "And Crane," Lydia said. "The fraud matter, Foss using a false name in commercial dealings, that's a separate matter that the court will take up independently. Crane's information-gathering activities fall under that umbrella. They won't escape consequences entirely." "Take the settlement," Phineas said. Cullen nodded and went back. 40 minutes later it was done. The secondary claim was withdrawn. The Watkins filing was formally confirmed in the court record as valid. Harlan Foss and Ellis Crane left Pueblo that evening on the southbound stage, considerably poorer and considerably quieter than they had arrived, and the particular brand of predatory scheme they had been running against isolated property holders, while not entirely eliminated from the world, because the world was not a place where such things could be entirely eliminated by a single court decision, was at least definitively stopped in this instance. Walking out of the courthouse into the March air, which was cold but had a different quality from January cold, a quality that carried in it the first small suggestion of something that was not quite yet spring but was thinking about it, Phineas took her hand. Not privately, not hesitantly. Just took it, in the open air and the public street, with the matter-of-fact confidence of a man who has decided something and is not inclined to be subtle about it. "I need to ask you something," he said. She looked at him. The Pueblo street was busy around them, the ordinary afternoon of a working territorial city moving on its own business, indifferent to whatever was about to happen between two people on the courthouse steps. "I've been thinking," he said, "about the cabin." "What about it?" "It's a good structure," he said. "Well built. Good stone foundation. The main room is large enough to be properly divided. If someone wanted to, you could add a proper parlor, separate from the working space. The view from the eastern window." He stopped. He was doing the thing he did when the mathematical part of his mind was trying to do the emotional part's work. She found it honestly one of the most endearing things she had ever encountered in a human being. "Phineas," she said, "yes. Are you trying to propose to me by describing your cabin's potential for renovation?" He looked at her, and the helpless warmth in his expression was full and real. "I'm making the case," he said, "that it could be a home for two people if one of them was willing." "Is that what you're asking?" "That is what I'm asking," he said. "Very badly, I'm aware." She looked at him for a long moment, this man who had come down from a mountain in January, who had looked at her across a crowded room and chosen to trust her, who described astronomical chapters with the precision of someone for whom they mattered, and who made cornbread in a cast-iron skillet and had 6 years of rebuilt silence inside him that was beginning carefully to let sound back in. "Yes," she said. "Yes, you'll marry me." "Yes, I'll marry you," she said. "And yes, the cabin. And yes, the renovation, but I want to keep the window that faces east. That view needs to stay." "The view stays," he said immediately. "Obviously." They were married in Dusty Creek in April, on a Saturday, in the church that was somewhat too small for the number of people who had decided to attend. Wallace Greer stood beside Phineas, which was appropriate because Wallace had, in the quiet way of genuinely good people, been essential to everything. Clara Birch sat in the front row and cried with the frank openness of someone who considered honest emotion a respectable activity and saw no reason to hide it. Even the Croft brothers, separately, on opposite sides of the aisle, as per the long-standing arrangement, were present, which said something about how thoroughly Lydia Hart had woven herself into the fabric of Dusty Creek in the 6 months since she'd stepped off the stage with a carpet bag and a reckless hope. The ceremony was simple and brief, in the way of frontier life, which did not always allow for the elaborate. Reverend Harris said the words. Phineas said the words back, in his low, careful voice, with an attention to their meaning that made her feel the weight of each one individually. She said the words back to him steadily, without any of the careful management that had been her habitual mode for so many years, because she had decided, somewhere between January and April, that the management was over, that this here was the thing she had been managing carefully toward without fully knowing it, and now that she was here, carefully was not what it required. When Reverend Harris said the words that concluded the ceremony and Phineas kissed her gently, and then less gently, and then Clara Birch laughed, and the room filled with the happy noise of people who have witnessed something true, she thought, with the particular clarity that arrives in the best moments, that she had never in her life felt so entirely in the right place. The spring and summer that followed were a kind of revelation. They divided their time as they had planned between the cabin at Reaper's Pass and Dusty Creek. She continued to manage the store, because Wallace had no intention of retiring yet, but had been genuinely pleased to have her take a more formal partnership role in the establishment, and because the store was important to her in ways she didn't need to justify. She was good at it. It mattered to the community. These were sufficient reasons. Phineas split his time between his trapping work, which he continued, though with a different relationship to it now, more purposeful and less driven by the need for isolation, and a project he had begun almost immediately after the marriage, which was a series of astronomical observations conducted from the pass, which had extraordinary clarity of sky and altitude enough to make certain measurements more precise than could be made at lower elevations. He was, she realized as summer progressed, genuinely brilliant in the way of people who have had brilliance go unrecognized for long enough that they've stopped expecting recognition and have simply continued doing the work for its own sake. He was corresponding by letter with an observatory in Ohio and with an amateur astronomical society in San Francisco, and the letters he wrote and received which she read, with his complete encouragement and her genuine fascination, were dense with observation and argument and the specific excitement of a mind that had found, after years of contraction, sufficient space to expand into. She started writing with him. Not astronomy specifically, but the intersection of their two competencies. She had a gift for clear and precise exposition that complemented his technical knowledge, and what began as her helping him revise a particularly tangled letter to Ohio became, gradually, a genuine collaboration. By August, they had a piece accepted in a natural science journal published out of Denver. Phineas Watkins and Lydia Watkins on the observational clarity of high-altitude sites in the Colorado Rockies, and she found she didn't mind the new name at all. She found, actually, that she liked it enormously, which was a thing she had not expected, and that pleased her with the quality of a genuine surprise. The cabin renovation happened in stages through the summer, with Phineas doing the structural work and Lydia having strong opinions about windows and storage, which he incorporated with a willingness that she found indicative of excellent character. The eastern window was enlarged. A proper parlor was created. The bookshelves expanded along two walls. There was a reading chair placed at an angle to the parlor stove that was, in Lydia's assessment, one of the more perfect pieces of domestic architecture she had ever encountered, and she used it on autumn evenings with a cup of tea and a book, and a specific quality of contentment that had no name in English but probably should. In the first week of October, exactly a year after Phineas had first come into the store with his winter supply list, and his careful handwriting and his not-quite-smile, Lydia Hart Watkins realized she was pregnant. She told him on a Friday evening, in the parlor of the cabin, with the first serious autumn cold pressing against the windows, and the stove doing its good, red work in the corner. She told him directly, because directness was her nature, and also because the particular quality of the news deserved to be received as clearly as it was delivered. He sat very still for a moment. She watched his face move through something complicated and arriving at something open and full. "A child," he said. "In approximately 7 months," she said, "by my calculation, which you'll want to verify with a doctor when we're next in town." 7 months, he said. He was doing the mental arithmetic. April, late April or early May. "The timing," she said, "will require some adjustment to the spring arrangements. I'll need to be in town by March at the latest." "March," he said, with the absolute agreement of a man whose priorities have just been completely and permanently reorganized. "We'll go down in March." He crossed the space between them and took her face in his hands, those large, warm, careful hands, and kissed her with a quality of tenderness that was, she thought, its own kind of answer to the years of difficulty that had preceded this moment. "Are you frightened?" he asked. "Yes," she said honestly. "Are you?" "Profoundly," he said with equal honesty. "And also," he stopped. "Also," she prompted. "Also," he said, "something I don't have an adequate word for. Something that feels like the answer to a very long question." "That's adequate," she said. Their son was born on the 8th of May, 1883, in a room above the Dusty Creek General Store, with a midwife named Mrs. Fairchild, who had delivered half the children in the valley, and had the reassuring confidence of supreme competence in her field. He was a large, noisy, extremely opinionated infant who, from his very first hours, seemed to have inherited his father's gravitas and his mother's utter refusal to be managed. They named him Samuel, for no particular reason except that when Phineas said the name in the room where his son had just arrived in the world, looking at the small, furious, magnificent person who was now irrevocably part of everything, the name felt correct in the way certain things feel correct without requiring justification. Wallace Greer held the baby before leaving for the store to spread the news, because spreading news was part of his community function, and he fulfilled it conscientiously. And he held Samuel with the care of someone who had been waiting patiently, for some time, for exactly this development. Clara Birch arrived with a pot of soup and stayed 3 hours and described, in specific and entertaining detail, the reaction of every person who had been in the store when Wallace came in to announce the birth, which confirmed what Lydia had suspected, that Samuel Watkins's arrival was, in Dusty Creek, treated as a community event rather than a private one, and that this was, she had come to understand, one of the genuinely good things about small places. Phineas sat beside her bed for the first evening with Samuel in his arms, learning the weight and reality of a person he had not imagined, a year ago, that he would have. And she watched him learn it, the careful way he adjusted his hold, the specific quality of attention he brought to every aspect of this new and enormous responsibility. And she thought that he was going to be extraordinary at this in the same way he was extraordinary at everything he chose to be extraordinary at, with patience and precision, and a seriousness that was the opposite of heaviness. The months and years that followed built themselves on the foundation of everything that had come before: the winter mornings in the store, the autumn conversation about Venus, the January descent that had been about love before it was about law, the spring marriage, the summer of collaboration and renovation, and the quiet, daily construction of a life that was genuinely their own. They had a second child, a daughter, born in the summer of 1885, whom they named Clara, for reasons that Clara Birch received with a dignity that barely concealed the fact that she was moved by it to her considerable depth. Clara Watkins was her mother's daughter in the most specific sense, dark-eyed, and organized and possessed of opinions that she expressed without apology from approximately the age of 2. Phineas went back to teaching, in his own fashion, not a college, but a correspondence education project he developed with the Astronomical Society in San Francisco, which ultimately became one of the first organized programs for distance learning in natural science available in the Colorado Territory. He worked on it at the cabin during winter months, writing by lamplight while Lydia read in the parlor chair, or wrote her own correspondence, or fell asleep over a book, which she did without embarrassment, and which he found, privately, one of the most beautiful things he had ever seen. She remained, for another 7 years, the manager and eventually the formal co-owner of the Dusty Creek General Store. When Wallace Greer finally retired to a small house his daughter had built for him on the south edge of town, and when he retired, he did so with the expressed satisfaction of a man who had made several good decisions in his life, and considered the advertisement in the Cincinnati Enquirer to have been among the best of them. Cullen, the lawyer, sent a card every Christmas. It was brief and professional, and always included a brief note about the state of territorial land law, which Lydia appreciated on principle. The legal protections for mountain property claims were actually strengthened in 1884, partly as a result of the pattern of cases that Cullen had compiled, the Watkins case among them, and presented to the territorial legislature as evidence of systematic abuse. This was not a perfect or complete remedy, because the law rarely managed to be either of those things entirely, but it was real progress, and Lydia noted it with the satisfaction of someone who has learned that sometimes the efforts you make against injustice do accumulate into something that matters, even when they happen in a small place and in a small way. Samuel grew up between the mountain and the town, comfortable in both, at home in neither exclusively, which Lydia thought made him the most truly Western person she knew, because the West at its best was always about the space between the settled and the wild rather than the certainty of either. He was, by the time he was 8, the most thorough reader in his school, which was not surprising given the density of the bookshelves in his home and the conversations that occurred at his family's table, where astronomy and literature and law and economics and the price of beaver pelts might all be discussed in the same meal. He was gentle and precise in the way of his father and fiercely honest in the way of his mother, and both of them agreed privately that they were not entirely sure how they had managed to produce such a satisfactory human being, but that they were grateful for it. Clara was noisier, more social, and absolutely certain about everything she thought, which made her family's life interesting in ways that were sometimes challenging and always alive. She was her brother's fiercest champion and occasional tormentor, in the way of siblings, and she could calculate the cost of any item in the store and make correct change faster than anyone in Dusty Creek, which at 6 years old made her useful, and at 12 made her formidable. On a January morning in 1891, exactly 9 years after Phineas had walked through the door of the store in the snow, Lydia stood at the eastern window of the cabin at Reaper's Pass and looked out at the mountain valley spread below her in the winter light. The sky was the deep, saturated blue she had noticed the first time she had ridden down from this place, and the snow on the peaks was so white it made everything below it look lit from within. Behind her, in the main room of the cabin, she could hear Phineas at his correspondence, the steady, quiet sound of a man writing carefully, which was not so different from the sound of thinking, really, when you knew the person well enough to hear the difference. Samuel was at the school in Dusty Creek and would come up on Saturday with Wallace Greer, who despite being retired made the mountain visit a monthly habit in the good weather months and a less frequent but still present one in winter. Clara was in the parlor reading a volume of natural history with the aggressive focus of someone encountering information they intend to retain permanently. Lydia thought about the advertisement in the newspaper, the carpet bag, the stage into Dusty Creek, the bell above the door and the man with the winter supply list and the careful handwriting and the not yet smile. She thought about January and the mountain, and the moment when he had walked through the door and the room had gone quiet, and she had told him to leave and known, even as she said it, that she didn't mean it, that she had never meant it, that the wanting him to stay had been there from October and was only getting more honest. She thought about what it meant to have been terrified and done the thing anyway, both of them, in their different ways, he coming down the mountain in January, she riding up it before that, both of them choosing trust in a world that had given them specific and serious reasons to be careful with it. It was, she thought, the most worthwhile thing she had ever done with her fear, Phineas appeared in the doorway of the parlor, which she was aware of without turning because she could feel him the way you feel a fire in a room, warmth and presence and a particular gravity. "You're quiet," he said. "Thinking," she said. "About January," she said. "The first one." He crossed the room and stood beside her at the window, and they looked out together at the valley and the mountains and the blue, extravagant sky. 9 years, he said. 9 years, she agreed. His arm came around her shoulders and she leaned into the warmth of him, and they stood there for a while in the quiet of the cabin and the mountain, not saying anything else, because the silence had been their companion almost from the beginning, and they had never needed to fill it with anything more than themselves. From the parlor, Clara Watkins announced, without looking up from her natural history volume, that the section on migratory birds was incorrect in its assertion about altitude, and that someone with access to good observational data should write to the publisher. Phineas looked at Lydia. Lydia looked at Phineas. "She's not wrong," she said. "No," he said. "She never is." And the mountain held them, as it always had, not as an escape, not as a distance from things, but as a height from which everything essential could be seen clearly. The town below with its ordinary and extraordinary life, the valley stretching out in the winter light, the sky above without limit. It held them in the good silence of a place that had witnessed something true and was content to go on witnessing it, season after season, for as long as the people in it were willing to stay. They were willing. They had always been willing, from the moment they understood what it was they were staying for, which was each other, and the life they had built together from the wreckage of separate difficulties and the discovery of a shared particular courage. The courage that is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to descend from the mountain in January, to ride up the mountain in the snow, to walk through a door towards someone you have decided to trust with the most careful and valuable thing you have, which is yourself. That was what it had been all along. That was what it remained. And it was, by every honest measure they had, more than enough.